War I is over, a lot of countries are ready to move on with life. War weariness had set in many different countries, and so people are ready to get back to normalcy. In fact, in 1920, Warren Harding in the United States will get elected to president by using the phrase "return to normalcy." Let's get back to the old way of doing things. But business is never going to be quite the same after World War One. That old system where Great Britain had acted as kind of like the world's banker, the British pound was a stable form of currency. Currencies were backed by gold. Uh, and the idea was we want international trade to grow and develop. That system is never coming back anymore. And there's some reasons why. During the 1920s, countries are going to enter a phase or take on a stance that we call economic nationalism. All right. And you see this poster here proclaiming America first. And it's the idea that countries started to realize, particularly during World War I, that being self-sufficient was definitely a desirable outcome. That way, you didn't have to rely on trading and transportation of goods to help you during wartime. If you were self-sufficient, you wouldn't have to worry about that in war, and it would give you a decided advantage over your enemies. So economic nationalism is going to become a thing, and with economic nationalism comes protectionism. And protectionism, the idea that you put up trade barriers to specifically encourage people to buy products that are manufactured in your country. So things like tariffs are going to become popular, taxes on imported goods. Sometimes you get quotas, import quotas, that you can only import so many of a particular product in any given year. And so countries start doing that, but the problem with these protectionist activities is it's going to cause other countries to retaliate. And so it's kind of like every man for himself. International trading is going to go into kind of a decline because people want to be self sufficient. Now, some other problems developed too, one of which was a massive rate of inflation towards the end of the war and even in the first few years after the war, and the change about the gold standard. What you see here are rates of inflation, especially you notice during the war years, inflation takes off. There's way more of a demand for certain goods and services during wartime, and people are rationing various products. So you're doing your best to get them, and the prices of these are naturally going to go up. Now you can even see after the war, there's still some high rate of inflation because during the war, so many of these things had been restricted or rationed that once the war's over, people are definitely in a hurry to go buy them, and they're willing to pay just about any price. Now, the inflation is going to drop off over time, and you're going to see those rates declining in the 1920s. But you also had to contend with the gold standard. Nations were tempted to go back to the gold standard. Some did, and some didn't. And that means you don't have a fixed rate of exchange anymore. If you're not on the gold standard, the value of your currency is going to fluctuate more radically than it would otherwise. The idea that you can trade in a British pound for a certain amount of gold sits well with a lot of people. But at the same time, the idea that paper money is valuable just because the country says so and just because the economic conditions are good, that scares a lot of people. That's a floating standard. And so the fact that not everybody's on the same standard makes it harder to do business internationally. Nations also had problems because they had debts to pay. And we're not just talking about Germany after the war. Obviously, they have the reparations that are necessary that they have to pay to France and Great Britain for the war. But another problem that we have is that the United States and our good friend Woodrow Wilson after the war, they want their money back. Remember, they loaned money to Great Britain and France in large quantities throughout the war. And America's in a different position. Before the war, they were a debtor nation. They were owing money to people. And now after the war, they're a creditor. And they want their money back. And Great Britain and France, they are shocked that their fellow ally during the war demands that they repay their debts. Great Britain and France already thought we paid for the war in blood. Our soil, especially in France, was damaged. Our factories, our ability to produce has been damaged. And so, how dare you sit around and tell us that we should pay you back for these war debts. And the thought process in America was, look, a deal is a deal. Now there were some Americans who didn't want to force the Allies to pay them back because they said it'll make economic recovery difficult for Great Britain and France, and it'll hurt the international community. But remember, we're thinking about ourselves in particular. So Great Britain and France, while they've got money coming in essentially from Germany, at the same time they owe a significant sum of money to the United States, and America is unwilling to let them off the hook. Now, you'll also see agricultural depression after the war. Depression meaning there's an extreme drop in the economic output of farms. What was happening is during the war, particularly with the Allies, is that the United States was providing farm assistance, food to the Allies because a lot of the land in France had been damaged and there was a genuine food scarcity going on. So that was an issue. And in the year or two involving the immediate aftermath of World War I, you also ran into the problem of they haven't rebuilt all the lands, including lands in Central Europe. The farmland wasn't quite ready to go. And so there's a real problem on the farms. They had produced all this food thinking that people will always want to buy our crops. And when the war ends, and eventually what happens is that demand for all the American crops goes down because eventually Europe is going to recover. And so Americans are left with a lot of crops that they can't necessarily sell everywhere. And crops that you can't sell, it's not like some type of inventory that you can pack away. Food will eventually spoil. And so American farms are going to be hit particularly hard during this time period. For a while, they were helping Europe through the war. They were helping them rebuild while they're rebuilding after the war. But you're going to see problems on the farms as well. Okay, so there's some economic trends occurring, but you're also seeing some political trends. Nations start becoming obsessed with security. The war exposed a lot of problems that nations had. France realized that they were more vulnerable than they thought. Germany obviously sees their condition change. Same thing with Russia and Great Britain. And so they're all thinking about their own security for the future. And many of their actions that we're going to see in the 1920s their decisions are made based on what's going to protect our nation, not what's good for everybody. And remember, too, one of the things that they'd agreed upon at the end of the war was creating a League of Nations. Okay, this was the League of Nations building that is named after Woodrow Wilson, but ironically, America's never going to be a part of it. The American Senate never authorized the United States to sign the Treaty of Versailles, even though Wilson helps negotiate it out. So Woodrow Wilson's name was on the building, but at the same time, the League of Nations is never going to have any real teeth to it because America is the strongest country left after the war, particularly with its economics. And so America couldn't always militarily force you to do something, but their economic power and the fact that nations owed them large sums of money meant that they could pressure you diplomatically. All right, so security is going to be an issue. The League of Nations isn't going to be quite what people thought because America is not going to be part of it. Now, what you also see during the 20s is a battle of ideologies. An ideology is just a term for a set of beliefs that you have. And so there's going to be existing problems with belief structure, and we want to go over some of those beliefs. Okay? One of them obviously is capitalism. This is something that the world has been contending with for some time. Capitalism is an economic system where a nation's trade and industry are controlled by private owners for profit. In a capitalist system like the one we live in, you make a business primarily so you can make money. The idea is that you invent things, you come up with good services because it's going to make you money. Now, a lot of people critiqued capitalism and said, listen, the drive for money, that greed is going to end us all. And so another popular belief system that's going to really take off during this time period is socialism. And that's where the idea is that the means of production, like the farms and the factories, that stuff should be controlled by the government, either owned or regulated strictly by the government, right? And a lot of people have a problem with that. But the idea was the government will look out for the interests of people better than a private business owner, because the government's going to think about the safety of the workers, and they're not going to let people get abused in capitalism, or like capitalism did. Think America in the Gilded Age, where there's that wealth inequality and people are getting hurt in factories or die in factories. And so you get capitalism and socialism. Now, a lot of people believed in socialism. They wanted to move from socialism eventually to communism. This is the idea that all goods and services, they're going to be community owned, that nothing will be done in terms of making money. You just go and work to the best of your ability, and you take only the resources that you need. This is the idea. It's a utopian form of government. And in communism, the idea is that you would go to your job and work every day, and then when you need to go to the grocery store or to buy new clothes, you wouldn't go buy that stuff. You just go take what you need. Right? It's a utopian concept, the idea that a perfect world, that's how we live. But the problem is, we know people are greedy, and they would never take just what they needed in order to get by. People always want more. Now, one other belief system, ideological system you see develop is what we call fascism. And it's hard to really pin this down, what it means, but the idea is that there's an authoritarian form of government, somebody, a massive leader, telling people what to do and how to live. It puts the country above all others and talks about the superiority of certain groups above others. Think of Nazi Germany. They're going to be one of the biggest proponents of fascism at the time. Now, these belief systems will come a little more clearly into focus when we talk about the nations who start to adopt them.